Tuberculosis is an ancient and widespread disease that we are still grappling with today, and its impact can be felt throughout our culture, including beauty and fashion, which were and unfortunately continue to be falsely blamed for its spread. Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about tuberculosis and its relationship in the 19th century with beauty and fashion. We're only going to be looking at a very small portion of its history, but it's a part that has had a tremendous effect on us today. You might have seen John Green's recent video about tuberculosis and its history and its current issues, which is a very important video if you haven't seen it yet. But as a historian who researched this subject extensively when writing my master's thesis on women's health and fashion in the 19th century, I was concerned at not only how much was skipped over, but how much was misattributed to stereotypes and myths that we have long since understood to be damaging. So I would like to clear up some of that with you and ideally at some point John Green. Tuberculosis is an incredibly complex disease and its history is no less complex. And that required an extreme campaign to keep people from panicking in the 19th century when it was at its peak. It was indiscriminately affecting both rich and poor, men and women, young, old, healthy and not, and it seemed so uncontrollable and scary that there were drastic efforts made in order to help society cope. Where in short, in America and Europe, it became romanticized to the extreme. As John himself put it, it became a disease of beauty, refinement, and intellectual sophistication. So how exactly did they accomplish all of that? Many today want to blame fashion and beauty ideals as they actually did in the 19th century before they understood how the disease worked. But the truth tells us so much more about our society both then and now. First, let's take a look at what tuberculosis is from a more modern perspective. It's an infectious disease caused by bacteria that can most commonly be found in the lungs. It can infect any other part of the body as well. However, the lungs seem to be the most common place that we start to see symptoms, like coughing and eventually coughing up blood. Untreated, it is a very deadly disease, and it's generally considered a wasting disease, meaning that in the 19th century they called it consumption because it seemed to consume the body. Though it is very deadly once it is active, only about 5 to 10% of those people who are infected with it will actually develop symptoms and have an active disease. It's not contagious during its latent period, and in those where it does eventually become active, it can be months or even years, which means that it is a very unusual infectious disease, and it's really hard to actually follow it around and track it, because it not only can be months or years before it shows up, but it can also be weeks, months, or years for the person, if left untreated, to actually succumb to the disease and pass away. So it is a very unpredictable and unmanageable disease historically. Today it is still a problem, but we do have the ability to treat it with a very aggressive course of antibiotics. This, of course, doesn't solve the problem that about a quarter of today's population is thought to be infected. And of course, historically, until the 20th century, antibiotics weren't an option. So as the disease peaked in the 19th century, really picking up steam in the late 17th century, it wasn't something that they could get a handle on. It was unpredictable and untreatable. Because it was so unpredictable, the belief that it was contagious, which had been generally roughly held for most of its history, was put aside in the late 18th century because it just wasn't matching up with the rise in cases like most other infectious diseases were. The fact that they didn't know how to prevent it, however, created a panic over the fact that it couldn't be avoided or treated. Eventually, research in the latter portion of the 19th century did prove that it was actually transferable through direct contact, and we started moving towards the model that we have today. But especially in the first half of the 19th century, they didn't have solutions to this problem, and as cities were growing and we were cramming more and more people into these small areas, living close to each other and transferring so many diseases back and forth, the numbers went up and up and up. So there was an effort to calm people down that attempted to explain how people were falling ill, very often by blaming them for the actions that got them there in the first place, but for those that weren't ill yet, they could be controlled for. And for those who were unfortunately already ill, all they could do was offer a form of comfort in place of that feeling of control. So to replace the idea that it was a contagious disease, instead they looked towards the ideas of predisposition and excitement. Predisposition simply meant that you came from a family that had consumption commonly, or that you regularly had other illnesses, or that you just simply looked like you might already be consumptive. Excitement, on the other hand, was all of the things that you could do to possibly aggravate this disease and make it more likely to show up. Anything from being too cold or too hot, being too active or too inactive, wearing the wrong types of clothing, doing the wrong types of activities, simply sleeping too much or sleeping not enough. They couldn't really decide on where the line fell as to how much of these things that you needed. Of course, today we have a much better idea of how much sleep is actually useful in your life, which is one of the reasons why I am so thankful that the sponsor for today's video is Brooklinen. If you're looking for high quality home goods, Brooklinen has a wide range of luxury sheets and home essentials, all without the luxury price markup. I've actually been buying my sheets and towels from Brooklinen for almost a decade now, discovering them when I went looking for better quality options that would actually last. I spend a third of my day here, after all. Summer has already been creeping its way in, and there's no better way to manage the heat than with natural fibers. I absolutely adore linen for my clothes and my sheets, so I had to go for the linen core sheet set. It's so soft and breathable, and this year I'm swapping out my comforter for this gorgeous linen quilt set, which comes with shams. The perfect balance between lightweight and cozy. I am always a fan of light and bright for summer. I swear these are the same fabrics my favorite 18th century summer outfit was, but Brooklinen has over 20 fun color combinations, so you can find something no matter what your decor style. Fair warning, their seasonal colors can sell out so fast. I'll definitely be mixing and matching with my colorful set too. So head on over to their site to play around with creating a new and fresh design for summer. Brooklinen is offering my viewers a special discount of $20 off any order over $100. Just click on the link below and use the code. Thanks again to Brooklinen for sponsoring this week's video. First up, let's take a look at the predisposition and what it meant to just simply look consumptive. Because the 19th century descriptions of what this disease looked like are really incredibly telling. As I mentioned, in the late stages, the body begins to waste away, so the person becomes incredibly thin. The skin becomes very pale and translucent, but with flushed cheeks and lips. The space around the eyes sinks back in, making them appear incredibly large and vibrant, while the pupils will also dilate. While this doesn't necessarily sound like the most attractive ideal, a lot of these elements, such as blush upon the cheeks or big, wide, bright eyes, have been considered to be aesthetic ideals of beauty for a very long time. And in the time, they wrote rather poetically about the way that this presented. One 1850 description states, "It is impossible to overlook or pass over in silence the indescribable beauty which meets you at every stage and in every scene of the last illness of such a patient." It's a beauty standard that we've had for a very long time, and we're still trying to understand why on a scientific basis. In fact, things like dilated pupils today we understand might be connected to our body expressing that we are attracted to someone or very excited and happy about something. And beauty has strived for a lot of those features for a long time. For example, the dilated pupil was something that could be obtained by dabbing a little bit of belladonna, which is a poison, on the eyelid. It had to be a very diluted amount, and this was something that we know was a bit more common in the 16th century. In the 19th century, however, when consumption was at its peak, it was not a commonly recommended thing. In fact, most of the references I could find in the 19th century were at the latter portion of it, where they talked about wealthy women who would use a very small amount right before really important big events. So it wasn't an everyday thing for even wealthy women, and it certainly wasn't a thing for the average person. This was an extreme way to achieve beauty, and they understood that it was potentially permanently damaging if they went about it in the wrong way. It's not something that we're seeing broadly used. When I went to look for it in the first half of the century, the only references that I came across for belladonna's use in eyes were medical ones, where doctors were talking about how it might be useful to treat certain conditions. So it doesn't appear to be a popular thing during the point where consumption was at its peak. Instead, we can find things like accenting the eyelashes or darkening around the eyes, adding blush or lip color, which again, all of those things are incredibly ancient practices from around the world. So it's not something new or specific to this era or to consumption in general. It just happens to align with the same ideals. But there is a second part to this. Consumption was not only believed to make the person more beautiful, but also to heighten the mind and encourage artistic endeavors. And this, I want to specify, is not just something for men. In nearly all of the language that I can find about this, they don't gender it. It's something that is broadly attributed. It's just that today we tend to see it more in reference to male artists and male poets because there are more of those. So you're going to see it be a little bit uneven. Add in the factor that what they're really talking about is what they would call a heightened sensibility. You are more aware of the world around you and much more sensitive to the changes and the emotions and all of that. And they already believed that women were more prone to that. So it wasn't a shocking and novel idea that it heightened that portion of women's sensitivities when they already were there. So it's not talked about in a gendered way, but you will see it mentioned more often as an interesting fact about men than women, just due to the imbalances of the time. Which brings us to the idea of excitement. What is that very long, weird list of things that you can do to excite consumption? Some things are a little more obvious, whether it's being exposed to cold and damp or insufficient food, insufficient exercise or air or light, things that we do know can cause you to feel poorly. They even sometimes blamed it on reading too much. Most often it was blamed on fashion, or quite often it was also blamed on those who were attempting to obtain the ideals of beauty, which is not quite the same thing as fashion. So fashion today might be anything from what the celebrities are wearing on the red carpet, which trickles down into what we wear every day, but the beauty ideals are more like the girl next door. It's not just what she looks like, but it's her personality that gets wrapped up into this as well. And that's the sort of beauty ideal that we're dealing with in the 19th century. This ideal constantly fluctuates throughout history. There isn't just one. Even when we look at very rudimentary versions of the way it seems to fluctuate for women, it, yes, can go back and forth in a silhouette from thin to more voluptuous, but it also tends to follow back and forth on ideals of gentle versus strong, of purity versus fertility, and so much more. And this era was particularly moving towards the idea of frailty as a defining factor in ideal femininity. Now, granted, this wasn't just a fluctuation for women. Men too went through the same fluctuations back and forth. Theirs were not necessarily the same exact attributes, but they also tended to fluctuate between an emphasis on the physical health and the mental health. So back and forth between strength and artistic natures. So at this time we are floating back towards that intellectual and artistic nature for both men and women over the physical body and physical health. We really can pinpoint the beginning of this in the mid-18th century, considering refinement and delicacy a very important aspect in attraction. Edmund Burke wrote in 1757 that women should be tranquil, composed, bright, gentle, and joyful, and it seemed to catch on. But not everyone liked this ideal. There was a lot of pushback to it. In 1811, La Belle Assemblée, which was a fashion magazine of the era, blamed Burke for the trend that picked up after this, saying the misapprehension of his notions may have contributed very largely to transform the gentle glow of healthful beauty into sickly languishment and affective debility by encouraging habits ruinous to the constitution. It was understood to be potentially damaging to health to force frailty. But just like today, this isn't an ideal that is intended for the everyday woman to strive after in completion. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to accomplish that. Most people today don't have that, no different than in the 19th century. You also have to have an inclination to want to achieve that ideal. But regardless of whether people actually strove for it in different ways or not, that sort of ideal still affected everyone, whether it was simply being judged for attractiveness or whether it was interests and activities that were encouraged or discouraged. So today, it might simply be when things are more popular, we will find them local to us. We are, in a sense, encouraged or discouraged from participating in certain things simply by how easy it is for us to participate or acquire them. So whether you want to actually strive for those ideals or not, you are still going to be affected by that ideal. And that was a recognized problem then as well. One man wrote in 1859, "Is it not a habit or predilection among our intellectual, well-educated men to choose wives of the most delicate and refined habits? And that these women end up being so concerned with being ladylike, they will sacrifice health and strength to achieve this. They aren't encouraged, for example, to get out of the house and go exercise, to go walking, to be outside working, to do physical activity, or just generally eating enough," which is sadly a problem that we still have today in the form of diets and the concerns over exercise and bulking up too much. So it's not like these issues and concerns have disappeared over the last 200 years. If anything, they have settled their way into our society to become a permanent fixture that we think is normal. So it's not a new issue, and connecting beauty and health has always been a very complex relationship, and that one does not necessarily lead to the other and very often will be at odds with it. And it just depends on which is the bigger concern. By the middle of the 19th century, the concern was headed back towards what they considered a healthier physical ideal, which was more supportive of fertility, because they were seeing a drop in birth rates during the middle part of the 19th century, specifically in white women, obviously. So what this means is that women and people in general aren't intentionally getting sick in this era just because the beauty ideals happen to coincide with consumption. Instead, what is happening is that they are adjusting their lives to better align with those ideals in terms of what they should do or not do, how they should be active or not, and in turn, those things are causing them to not only look a bit more consumptive, but actually get sick more often. So we are seeing blame constantly shouted across literature, because there has to be a way to fix this if people just tried harder. And this is where fashion comes in. The stylish clothing that people are choosing to wear comes without any of those positive personality traits. If anything, it's more the things that are vilified. And today we will tend to think of corsets first and foremost as a great example of this, but they were only one element in the many that were blamed. Most of it comes down to too much clothing or too little clothing. If you have too much clothing, you are stifling the body, you're sweating a great deal more, so as all of the bad things get excreted out of you, you're just pushing them right back in by not giving them space to leave the body. Of course, on the opposite end of things, there's too little clothing in which too much skin is exposed, and they believe that this would cause the pores and everything to close up, and you wouldn't be able to get rid of all of those things in the first place. So either way, everything is staying in your body when it shouldn't be, and that is one of the potential ways that causes illness. When it came specifically to consumption, they thought that this really discouraged good blood flow. As your blood made its way down to the extremities, before it made its way back, it was not getting rid of what it needed to, it was getting too cold, and it would end up stagnating in different areas, such as the lungs, where it would pool and eventually burst, and that was one of the theories of what might cause tuberculosis. So they freaked out about pretty much every type of clothing that there was, whether it was your shoes being too thin, for both men and women, whether it was your stockings being too thin or not out of the right fiber, whether it was having too much of your skin exposed. Dresses in the 1820s and 30s, for example, were moving to an off-the-shoulder style, so a lot more of the collarbones and neckline were exposed, and they panicked about that, despite the fact that there were plenty of fashion options available to cover up in the colder weather. But still, too lightweight of fabrics, too lightweight of suits, not having the right undergarments made out of wool or made out of linen was a big argument. Even men's waistcoats and the fact that they were starting to drop from being really high up at the neck was something that they talked about at different points in the 19th century. So the waistcoat that I'm wearing, which I just reproduced off of a 1900s waistcoat, was considered potentially just too much exposure and would make you ill. At the same time, they praised the fact that the chokers, as they call them, were going out for men with the very high collars that covered the neck too much. So it seemed very much in a range of you can't win. No matter what your clothing is, it's probably going to be too light or too heavy for whatever situation you're in. They had equal concerns over the rising of hems and thought that perhaps because young girls were picking up different styles of dresses at certain ages with higher hemlines that were fashionable in the 1830s, 40s, and into the 50s, that they were exposing their legs too much. But they also had concerns that things like petticoats were adding up to be too much weight, not just because of the heat issues, but also because of the overall weight and the fact that they were hanging on the body and they weren't putting that weight on shoulder straps, which is one of the reasons why suspenders lasted so much longer for men rather than moving on to belts, because they thought it was more helpful to suspend the weight of your clothing from your shoulders than from your waist around where the organs such as digestion were, and that potentially could interrupt that process and cause all number of different ailments. So they were concerned about the weight of the clothing on the body as well, hence why we also moved into things like cage crinolines in the 1860s instead of multiple petticoats. That was also just a comfort matter because those skirts were incredibly heavy with all of those petticoats, and they were all meant to hang about the waist, which is actually where the corset comes into play as a positive concept, because that would help distribute the weight and keep it from actually putting all of that weight onto your waist and hip bones and organs. Now, of course, corsets weren't actually given the credit that they were due for helping support the weight of skirts. Instead, they have managed through history to become probably the most vilified garment of all time. And since they were so specifically brought up in John Green's video as an example of the problem, I do feel a little bit obligated to spend some time on those. It's particularly notable because at the peak of consumption, when we see the 1820s through the 1860s, these were the types of corsets that they were wearing. In fact, these 3 corsets I reproduced and have worn numerous times as reproductions of corsets from the 18-teens, the 1830s, and the 1860s. And as you can see, they are incredibly soft and unstructured, especially the earlier ones. The only structure you're really going to find is the busk down the front. It is simply there to make sure you have really good posture and to lift and separate. It is the most uncomfortable part of the whole thing, and it is removable for that reason. But this wasn't the era of tight lacing as we think of it. Yes, tight lacing was something that was mentioned as of roughly the 1830s, when the waistline of these gowns dropped low enough that you could actually see the waist of a person. In the 18-teens, not really a problem. No reason to make your waist small if you can't see it. But in the 1830s, these are still very soft corsets, and tight lacing is not going to do all that much. It's not really until we reach the latter part of the 19th century where they have a little bit more structure, a little bit more shaping, and corsets can really achieve that strong hourglass figure that we attribute to them. It's really more just an 1870s through the 1890s thing before we start changing up the silhouettes entirely again. And so it's really a very small window of that hourglass style, and tight lacing is a very rare and very ridiculed thing. It's not something the average woman did on an average day. They needed to be able to function in these garments, and they offered bust support, back support, and of course support for those really heavy skirts. And the reasoning that you can find for why they say tight lacing existed as a broad issue are things like this 1866 article that says tight lacing used to be such a big problem. Look at how they drew their fashion plates, which we all know are just meant to actually render realistic humans somehow, because this doesn't look like AI made it or anything. They were meant to be extreme idealizations of the silhouette that was desirable at the time, not actually realistically achievable. Just take a look at 1830s men. That is a lot of something going on there. And even in the latter portion of the 19th century, when corsets were still being used, and if anything, the hourglass figure was at its peak, they'd say things like, "Time was when women whose waist could be spanned by the 2 hands was of the angelic type." When was this time? I would like to know, because I haven't been able to find any evidence of that really ever being the case. It's just not practical. Instead, what women did was build everything else up. They used false deceivers. They used pads in different places. They used the fact that these sleeves will make anything look really tiny next to them. The 1830s went completely nuts when it comes to silhouette. Your waist is going to look tiny just by comparison to the overwhelming amounts of fabric. And the so-called medical and scientific studies being made of corsets at the time are far from that. We know how incorrect their scientific studies were, but yet we continue to believe them when they write things like, "And then comes fashion, the handmaid of death, and puts a girdle about the waist and ties down the ribs and sets at naught the laws of God. The lungs are distended in one part and compressed in another. The heart flutters against its prison walls like a caged bird." That's a medical text. Does not sound very medical to me. There's more representational ideas behind this than actual science, because women needed to be able to function and breathe. Otherwise, they wouldn't have worn those corsets. They wouldn't have continued to make that choice. And the fact that women weren't just dropping like flies in the streets on a daily basis didn't seem to deter them from continuing to shout about this. So why were they so concerned? Why was this such a big problem? First, they attributed this to an issue of middle and upper class women. They didn't think it was an issue for the poor because, in their words, we're not exposed to fashionable follies. These illnesses that fashion caused, or even just the proclivity towards fashionable interests, was something that was passed down to children, whether genetically or through teachings, and that would lead to the downfall of nations and the races. So they were certainly concerned about the potential that this damaging fashion, as they believed it to be, could have on the broader society. And on top of that, it presented them with a wonderful opportunity. You start to see evidence in the way that they describe these women, saying basically that their mothers or their fathers or their husbands or any other family members failed them. They didn't make sure to set them back on the right path. And that's where this really starts to make a lot of sense. Because these accusations weren't just set forward in order to fix the illness, they were set forward as an excuse for why women really can't be left to their own devices. Leave her alone for a few minutes and she starts wearing all these clothes that are gonna kill her. They thought that women were more prone to what they called approbativeness, that their low self-esteem would lead to vanity and concerns over their appearance that would be more important than anything else, that they would be swept away by shiny objects and emotions, essentially. And that meant that they needed to put laws and regulations in place, perhaps just admonishment from the family or even from your doctor, who gets to make medical decisions for you, by the way. And especially since it affected the next generation as much as women themselves, it gave reason as to why women couldn't vote, why they shouldn't be able to have control over their own lives without being watched in some way. And we continue to see that stereotype used throughout the next 200 years in terms of, well, women can't be left alone with their spending. They'll go out and buy all of these things that they don't need, so we can't let them have control over their own money. Women are just too emotional to be able to make their own decisions. So why didn't women just buck those stereotypes and stop acting so emotional, stop playing along with this? Quote from 1869 unfortunately does a really good job of explaining it, saying that, "But what can we say when originality is still censured as unwomanly, and a public protest, be it even against evil, is set down as strong-minded and unfeminine?" So no different than today, a constant onslaught of do this and don't do that becomes something we just block out until something can be obviously shown as damaging. And even then, we very often just look to moderate our use of said thing. So if fashion was largely condemned for exciting consumption, not seen as a celebration of it, what was the actual source of the romantic mindset around it? We can look to the connection in the 19th century between hygiene, not just of the body, but of the entire society, health and all of its different formats, and morality. Stories like The Water Babies, for example, which tells the story of a young boy who works as a chimney sweep and is always constantly filthy. He dies in a drowning accident, is put into some sort of weird purgatory where he becomes a sprite or a water baby, and he has to learn the importance of cleanliness. So he will eventually be able to find, quote, happiness and spiritual redemption. So a very extreme version of the idea of cleanliness is next to godliness, and the fact that he needs to understand just how important hygiene is in order to be let into heaven. And illness was very often seen as an opportunity for redemption, even if their sins led them there. One great example of this in a story about consumption is about a character named Agnes Waltham, and she goes out wearing too light of clothing, despite the fact that her parents and her fiance repeatedly tell her not to, that it's very dangerous. She does it anyway, and she ends up with a little bit of a cold, which turns into consumption. And as she is laying on her deathbed after trying for months to get better and failing, she is slowly dying, and she says, "Yes, I have been sinful. Vanity forbade me to do as you wished, and now I reap as I have sown. Oh, that fatal pride of dress." She smiled, and it was an angel's smile. The term angel here is very notable because that is the terminology that they so often used for people who were consumptive, that they were angels, which speaks to the whole morality and religious aspect that comes into play here. There are countless fictional stories about people dying of consumption, and nearly all of them include a section where the person is comforting their loved ones, who are mourning them as they are really reaching the end of this illness, and they will often give them comfort by saying, "Don't worry, I know that I'm going to heaven," or that their creator is near, or that sometimes even Jesus is in the room with them and as real to them now as the other people around them. That essentially religion is where they find comfort in these final moments, and they share that with people, and they were thought to be somewhere in between the living and the dead, somewhere where they had closer access to heaven than any living being on earth, and they shared that comfort with their family. So the romanticization of consumption is offered up as comfort as the disease progresses to both the dying and the grieving family. So consumption wasn't fashionable because people were going out of their way to enact these ideals of being ill, but instead that they held up these ideals as a way to get them through difficult times. Simultaneously, fashionable trends were actually being used as a scapegoat. The important thing here is that societal norms were the thing that were shaping both fashion and ideals. And so it's natural that there is some overlap, but to conflate the two and assume that fashion somehow made tuberculosis worse is way off. Fashion was not meant to mimic or glorify consumption. There was no actual consumptive chic, which, by the way, is a book title, which I do highly recommend this book. Not a phrase that they used in the time. Chic wasn't even a word that was commonly used until the latter portion of the 19th century in that way. So that was not a phrase that existed during that time. If anything, fashion was vilified and blamed for exciting consumption, thus blaming anyone who participated in it for their own demise. While we certainly can't go backwards in time and manage to prove that fashion actually didn't cause these problems to the people that lived in that era, we do still have control over their words and ideas today. We read these things as truth or lies, as accurate or exaggeration, and draw conclusions about these things that still affect us today. Our stereotypes of gender, illness, fashion, beauty, and so much more were molded by this era. It's been long enough that we've forgotten their source and have taken them to just be natural states of things. So the idea that women were stupid and vain enough to physically harm themselves is a problem. John does a really great job of explaining why othering when it comes to illnesses is a really big problem, whether we are othering people in a positive or negative way. It feels safer for us to think of them as unlike us and pile up the strange and silly accusations that has brought us to a place where we are so different from them, but we haven't changed that much. We still battle the same issues and the same disease. And John Green, if you did actually happen to watch any of this, or anybody that can connect me to him, I would love to sit down with you and spend hours nerding out about this topic, because I have so much more to share, and I know you're doing amazing things with the current issues around tuberculosis. I'm in Indiana all the time, so I would love to be able to sit down and share my special interest with you. You're not helping. You are really not helping. I love you so much, and I'm gonna start this whole thing over at this rate. This is not helpful. Come on. Come on. Come on. Bailey. Ma'am. Hi.